As agreed, Sam assumed half the debt and left his marriage with the clothes she hadn't burnt in their backyard fire pit, his tools, his jalopy, and a verbal agreement regarding custody, visitation, and the generous, guilt-laden amount of child support he'd pay for his biological son Russell and the twins he'd legally adopted, which their deadbeat biological father was still celebrating. Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter. Since Sam and Cassie hadn't spoken for several months, and they'd done an exceptional job of avoiding the other at work, they had a lot of catching up to do. Cassie started her update by describing her day in court and the ongoing custody battle she and Rich were engaged in, and shared how Sam's name and his being under the care of a psychiatrist had been included in Rich's legal rhetoric, which turned out to be true and led them to deducing that their exes were in cahoots. Sam then explained how upon his return he and Darlene had gone to marriage counseling, but it had only made things worse because throughout the sessions she constantly lied, which confirmed she wasn't the partner or mother she claimed to be, and he'd subsequently lost the last of his respect for her. After he acknowledged she was a fraud and he'd been deceived, he said he'd passed through the anger and bargaining stages of the grieving process quickly, but he still couldn't get past his overwhelming guilt, which led to his getting stuck in the depression stage. So he went to see a psychiatrist on his own, and he'd taken an SSRI antidepressant for a few weeks. But he didn't like the sexual side effects, so he took the anxiolytic lorazepam instead and drank himself into oblivion as soon as the kids went to bed. Eventually, he admitted he'd actually fallen in love with being a father to Darlene's twins. Once he got there, he reflected on all the warning signs he'd denied and admitted he'd married a toxic woman who most likely would never change. Then he accepted he couldn't raise healthy children if he became toxic too, and left her for a second time. He added he'd been living at his parents' house for the last month, and during that time he'd easily stopped drinking so much, but he was having a horrible time withdrawing from the benzodiazepine. When he initially stopped taking the pills, he said he became anxious, irritable, and couldn't sleep. A few days later, he started shaking, sweating, and he'd gotten the dry heaves. And because his head and muscles ached, originally he thought he was sick with a stomach flu. But he eventually realized it wasn't a virus, but rather he'd developed a physiological dependence on the lorazepam, which the alcohol encouraged, and he was actually experiencing benzodiazepine withdrawal syndrome, and added that now that he had first-hand experience with them, he'd most definitely stop handing them out like candy at work. They talked about their next steps and considered seeing each other on the down low for a while, but both were concerned about Rich and what he might do next. So Sam made plans to move into Cassie's townhouse, and they became an instant family. Along with being grateful she'd become a nurse and had a good paying job, Cassie was glad she'd kept her maiden name and her original bank accounts, which had helped her to establish her own excellent credit rating. At the time, she'd already held a mortgage and she'd paid off her student loan. In her wallet, she had 3 credit cards, which didn't carry a balance, and she had her own line of credit. However, her half of her home's equity had gone towards paying her lawyer, and because she suspected they'd finally agree on the original terms of joint custody without child support, Cassie thought she'd essentially wasted what could have been the down payment on her next home on responses to farcical letters from Rich and his lawyer. Then she found out Rich's lawyer was even more expensive than hers, after she estimated how much generational wealth they'd wasted in total. Her perspective on the depreciating lawyer joke she heard changed, and she swore that in the future she'd only contact her lawyer if absolutely necessary.
Cassie, why'd the lawyer cross the road to get to the accident on the other side? What's the difference between God and a lawyer? God doesn't think he's a lawyer. How do you know when a lawyer's lying? His lips are moving.
After Sam moved into the townhouse, Candace, or Candy, which was the name she actually preferred, moved in with Rich, which helped him to recover from his more costly legal fees quickly, because she worked as a receptionist in a legal firm and did not have any children of her own. Referred to as a dumb blonde behind her back, Candy was best known for her short skirts versus her shorthand, and for the clicking sounds her long manicured nails made on her keyboard. But she wasn't so dumb, because along with learning how to earn more than she was worth, she knew how to earn the frequent and mostly inappropriate compliments her desperate for attention ego needed. Since both of their parenting plans revolved around Cassie and Sam working 12-hour shifts, they always had their kids when they weren't at work. If they wanted to have a childless day, they had to use vacation time. The co-parents of their children, however, were childless every other weekend, and on either 2 or 3 weeknights each week, which worked out well for Candy, who wasn't interested in becoming a mother herself, but liked the idea of part-time step-parenting, especially because it gave her an excuse for the retail therapy she thrived on. On paper, it looked like Rich had the children 50% of the time, but in reality, they'd go days without seeing their father. But because she wanted peace, she didn't point out the difference, or that technically the only time they needed a babysitter were on the days the kids were in Rich's custody. For that same reason, she didn't compare grocery bills or how much she spent on diapers, since their nanny only came to her home. But she did take exception to Candy purchasing expensive brand name clothing for their kids, which led them to not only buying their own supply, but to Rich's fixation on what outfits they were allowed to wear on the days they were in their mother's custody. Despite his pettiness, Cassie thought her children were better off because their standard of living was the same at both houses, and except for 2 Sundays each month, she got to see her kids every day. Sam and Darlene's story, however, was much different, because other than their furniture and a decaying Monte Carlo, they owned nothing and had racked up $15,000 in credit card debt. As agreed, Sam assumed half the debt and left his marriage with the clothes she hadn't burnt in their backyard fire pit, his tools, his jalopy, and a verbal agreement regarding custody, visitation, and the generous, guilt-laden amount of child support he'd pay for his biological son Russell and the twins he'd legally adopted, which their deadbeat biological father was still celebrating. Unlike Rich, who made everything as difficult as possible for Cassie, Sam went out of his way to placate Darlene. Since the townhouse was 50 kilometers away, and Darlene absolutely refused to deliver or pick up Russell and the twins, Sam had to do all the driving. Between going to and from work and dropping off and picking up the kids from school, Sam was driving either 100 or 200 kilometers every day, except for 2 Sundays of each month. Cassie knew Sam wasn't a pushover, and the only reasons he did all the driving and didn't complain about it was because he was a good father who genuinely wanted to spend time with his kids and didn't want to spend the little money he had on legal fees. However, when the expense of the gasoline and the frequent repairs of his jalopy ate up the last of his paycheck and then some, he secretly went and got another credit card and had the statements mailed to his parents' house so Cassie wouldn't know he was going further into debt. Hola, hola, pupils! If you're enjoying my fictional self-healing series, I'd love your feedback. I'd also love it if you'd feed the algorithm by following me and liking the post. And if you're stuck in the mindset and frequency of a puppet, and you'd like an energy session with me, please reach out and we'll make it happen.